In the spring of 1991, Ford tractors were the best-selling farm tractors in the United States. The blue machines were moving off dealership lots faster than any competing line. Ford's dealer network, more than 1,200 locations strong, stretching from the grain counties of Iowa to the tobacco fields of North Carolina, was profitable. The farmers knew the product. The parts were available at every county seat in the country. The name on the hood meant something on every working farm in America. 6 months later, Ford sold every tractor it owned to Fiat of Italy for $600 million. Not the underperforming models, not a struggling regional operation. All of it. The engineering files, the dealer agreements, the New Holland, Pennsylvania assembly plant, the name, the blue paint, the loyalty of 3 generations of American farm families who had never owned anything else and had never been given a reason to. A decade earlier, that same Ford Motor Company was the direct institutional heir of Henry Ford, a man who believed, with the conviction of someone who had grown up behind a horse on a Michigan farm, that liberating the American farmer from animal power was the most important thing an industrial company could ever do. Who built tractor prototypes in his Dearborn machine shop before Ford Motor Company had any interest in building one? Who once told his engineers that if he could make only one more thing before he died, it would be a tractor cheap enough for any American farmer to own. But the real story of Ford tractors is not the sale to Fiat. It is the story of what happens when the greatest agricultural engineering achievement in American history becomes, in the ledgers of a publicly traded conglomerate, a line item that no longer justifies its capital allocation. America built the tractor. America tooled the farm. America sold the name. We tell the stories of how that happened one brand at a time. Subscribe if you want to keep hearing them. This story begins in Dearborn, Michigan in 1917, on a farm that Henry Ford never stopped thinking of as home. Henry Ford grew up behind a horse. He was born in 1863 on an 80-acre farm in Dearborn, Michigan, then a township of fields and orchards 12 miles west of Detroit. And he spent his boyhood doing what every American farm boy did, following a draft horse across a field, holding a plow that weighed more than he did, doing work that was physically brutal and economically marginal. The horse consumed roughly 20% of a farm's total crop yield simply to feed and maintain itself. It was, in Henry Ford's specific and unsentimental view, a thermodynamic arrangement that no rational engineer would design if starting from nothing. He hated the inefficiency. He did not hate the farm. By 1907, a full year before the Model T entered production, Ford had already built tractor prototypes in his Dearborn machine shop. His engineers called them automobile plows. The patents were filed. The engineering was serious. But Ford Motor Company's investors had no interest in farm equipment. They had a car to sell, a factory to scale, and a market that was growing faster than anyone could manage. So Ford did what Henry Ford did when the company would not move. He moved separately. In 1917, he incorporated Henry Ford and Son, a legally distinct company deliberately separated from Ford Motor Company, for the sole purpose of building and selling tractors. The factory was in Dearborn, Michigan. The first product was the Fordson Model F, a name derived with typical Ford directness from the company's own title. The Fordson was not the first gasoline-powered tractor in America. Hart Parr of Charles City, Iowa, the company that coined the word tractor, had been building working machines since 1902. International Harvester's Titan and Mogul lines had been selling to American farmers since 1910. What those machines shared was price. A comparable International Harvester tractor in 1918 sold for roughly $1,400. The Fordson Model F sold for $750, or approximately $15,000 in today's money, and Ford intended to drive that number lower every year through volume production. He applied every principle from Highland Park to the Dearborn tractor plant: standardized components, assembly line production, volume pricing that treated the American farm family not as a luxury buyer but as a mass market that deserved a machine it could actually afford. The results were immediate and overwhelming. In 1918, Henry Ford and Son produced 34,067 Fordson tractors. By 1925, annual output had reached 104,068 units. At peak, the Fordson held more than 75% of the American tractor market, a dominance no single agricultural equipment brand has achieved before or since. The USDA's 1920 agricultural census recorded tractor adoption rates climbing at twice the pre-Fordson pace. Implement and Tractor magazine, the trade publication read by every farm equipment dealer in the country, called the Fordson the machine that finally made the American small farm financially viable. Henry Ford had done exactly what he set out to do. Then, in 1928, he stopped. International Harvester had responded to the Fordson with a genuine engineering advance, the Farmall row crop tractor, a machine designed to straddle planted rows and cultivate between them, something the Fordson's architecture could not do without a complete redesign. Ford chose discontinuation over reinvention. Henry Ford and Son was folded into Ford Motor Company in 1920, the tractor and automobile operations consolidated under one corporate roof, and the Fordson quietly withdrawn from the American market 8 years later. The pattern had been established. Ford would enter the American farm market with something transformative, dominated entirely, then be caught flat-footed by the next engineering inflection, and respond too slowly, too tentatively, or not at all. It would happen again, and when it did, the consequences would be permanent. But before the fall, there was a handshake, and the handshake changed everything. Harry Ferguson was an Irish engineer and an obsessive. He was small, precise, argumentative, and correct, traits that made him difficult to work with and impossible to ignore. By the late 1930s, he had spent 2 decades developing a tractor implement attachment system of such elegant mechanical logic that every agricultural engineer in Europe had either studied it, attempted to replicate it, or quietly incorporated it into their own designs without acknowledgement. Ferguson's invention was the 3-point hitch combined with hydraulic draft control. The 3-point hitch is a triangulated linkage system, 2 lower arms and 1 upper link, that connects an implement directly to the rear of a tractor. Before Ferguson, farm implements were pulled on trailing hitches, a chain or drawbar connection that allowed the implement to move independently of the tractor. This arrangement was mechanically simple and physically dangerous. A plow that struck buried rock or hard-pan soil could lever the rear of the tractor violently off the ground, flipping the machine backward onto the operator. Agricultural safety records of the period estimated that tractor rollovers killed approximately 3,000 American farmers per year through the 1930s and into the 1940s. Ferguson's geometry eliminated the physics that caused it. The 3-point linkage transferred resistance from the implement directly into downward force on the tractor's rear wheels, meaning the harder the plow worked against the soil, the more traction the tractor gained and the more stable the machine became under load. The hydraulic draft control, an automatic sensing system that raised or lowered the implement to maintain constant working depth, regardless of terrain, completed the system. Together, these 2 elements allowed a lighter, less expensive tractor to do the productive work of a heavier one, while simultaneously protecting the operator from the machine's most lethal failure mode. Ferguson took his system to Henry Ford in October 1938. The meeting took place at Ford's Fairlane estate in Dearborn, Michigan. Ferguson demonstrated the system on a small tractor he had shipped from England. Ford drove it himself in the field behind the house. The 2 men, one an American industrialist in his mid-70s, the other an Irish engineer in his 50s, recognized immediately what the combination of Ford's manufacturing scale and Ferguson's system architecture could produce. At the end of the afternoon, they shook hands. No contract was signed, no lawyers were present, no document was executed. The agreement, recorded in agricultural history simply as the handshake agreement, was that Ford would manufacture tractors incorporating Ferguson's system. Ferguson would sell them through his own dealer network, and the 2 men would share the American market between them on the basis of mutual trust and a single afternoon's demonstration in a Michigan field. The Ford 9N entered American production in June 1939 at the Dearborn, Michigan plant. It weighed 2,040 pounds. It produced 28 horsepower at the belt pulley. The rotating drum at the tractor's side used to drive stationary equipment like threshers and grain elevators. It incorporated the Ferguson 3-point hitch and hydraulic draft control as standard equipment, not optional additions. The American list price was $585, roughly $12,500 in today's money. The nearest comparable International Harvester tractor, without 3-point hitch capability, sold for $185. By the end of 1939, Ford Ferguson dealers had sold 10,133 units. By 1941, annual sales reached 43,777. The USDA Cooperative Extension Service, the federal agency that provided agricultural guidance to every American county through its network of local agents, tested the Ford 9N and recommended it specifically for small and medium American farms. The War Production Board, managing American industrial output after Pearl Harbor, approved a modified wartime version, the Ford 2N, for continued production through 1945 on the grounds that agricultural output was a strategic military necessity. Then came the Ford 8N, introduced in 1947, the year Henry Ford died, and with it, the single most commercially successful farm tractor in American history. More than 500,000 units sold in 4 years of production. A machine so mechanically sound, so well proportioned to the American family farm, and so thoroughly supported by a standardized parts network that examples purchased new in 1950 are still working American fields today. The nameplate on the hood was not a city of origin. It was a standard. Every tractor built after 1939, from John Deere to Massey Ferguson to Kubota to Fendt, incorporated a version of the system that Ford and Ferguson proved in a Dearborn field on an October afternoon with no contract and no lawyers and nothing but 2 men's word. Ford had not just built a tractor, Ford had written the architecture of modern agriculture. What Ford did with that inheritance is the rest of the story. By the early 1950s, the Ford tractor had become something more than a machine. It had become infrastructure, as fundamental to the American farm as the barn, the grain elevator, and the county road that connected both to the market. In the Corn Belt counties of Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana, where a family farm of 200 to 500 acres represented the productive backbone of American food supply, the Ford tractor was not a purchase decision. It was an inheritance. Fathers bought them, sons maintained them, grandsons restored them. The blue hood and gray body of a Ford utility tractor in a Midwestern equipment shed was as unremarkable and as essential as the shed itself. The numbers reflected it. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, Ford Tractor Operations, the division of Ford Motor Company responsible for design, manufacturing, and distribution of agricultural equipment, held between 25 and 30% of the American utility tractor market. In a market served by International Harvester, John Deere, Massey Ferguson, Alice Chalmers, and Oliver, a single brand holding more than 1/4 of total American sales was not a market position. It was dominance. The institutional endorsements were specific and cumulative. The Future Farmers of America, the National Vocational Agriculture Organization, whose chapters operated in nearly every rural American high school, standardized the Ford tractor as the teaching machine for agricultural mechanics curricula across the country through the 1950s and 1960s. Hundreds of thousands of American farm boys learned to operate, maintain, and repair a tractor on a Ford. The brand did not advertise to them. It trained them. An operator trained on a Ford at 16 was a Ford buyer at 26 and a Ford advocate at 60. The United States military purchased Ford tractors for ground support operations at air bases and Army installations throughout the Korean War period. The machines moved ordnance, towed aircraft on flight lines, and maintained airfield grounds at installations from Lackland Air Force Base in Texas to bases across the Pacific Theater. The Ford tractor's mechanical simplicity, the same quality that made it maintainable on an Iowa farm with hand tools, made it equally maintainable by military ground crews operating far from established supply chains. The Marshall Plan extended Ford's reach beyond American borders in ways that reinforced domestic standing. Between 1948 and 1952, American agricultural equipment exported to rebuilding Western European nations under the European Recovery Program included substantial quantities of Ford tractors, purchased by the United States government and delivered to French, Italian, and West German farming communities that had lost their agricultural machinery base to wartime destruction. Ford tractors plowed French fields in 1949 under American foreign aid appropriations. The brand that Henry Ford built for the American farmer had become, briefly, the machine that fed a rebuilding continent. Back in America, the dealer network was the competitive moat that no imported brand could easily breach. By the mid-1960s, Ford Tractor Operations supported more than 2,000 authorized dealers across the United States, a distribution infrastructure built over 4 decades that placed a Ford parts counter and a Ford-trained service technician within practical reach of virtually every working farm in the country. When a Ford tractor broke down at planting time, the 72-hour window in the American Midwest, when soil conditions, moisture content, and temperature aligned for corn planting, and when a broken machine meant a lost season, a Ford dealer could put a replacement part on the counter the same day. John Deere could make the same claim. International Harvester could make the same claim. No imported brand could, not in 1965, not yet. That competitive reality, the last true American moat in the tractor market, was about to be tested in ways that Ford Motor Company's boardroom had not anticipated and would prove structurally unable to answer. The cultural peak of Ford's American tractor story did not arrive in a boardroom or a trade publication. It arrived in a courtroom. In 1948, Harry Ferguson filed suit against Ford Motor Company in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Michigan. The claim was $340 million, the largest civil damages demand in American legal history at that moment. Ferguson alleged that Ford had unilaterally terminated the handshake agreement of 1938, copied his patented system without license, and sold more than 500,000 tractors incorporating his three-point hitch and hydraulic draft control without paying him a single dollar in royalties. Every Ford 8N on every American farm was exhibit evidence. The lawsuit proceeded for 4 years. Ford's legal defense was substantial and expensive. The engineering testimony ran to thousands of pages. Ferguson's attorneys documented, patent by patent and component by component, the degree to which the Ford 8N's implement attachment system derived directly from Ferguson's original designs. Ford's attorneys argued modification, independent development, and the ambiguity inherent in an agreement made without documents, without witnesses, and without lawyers. In 1952, Ford Motor Company settled for $925 million. No admission of wrongdoing was entered into the record. No individual at Ford was held personally accountable. The settlement was, by the standard of the original $340 million demand, a fraction. But the fraction confirmed what every agricultural engineer already understood. The system that had made the Ford tractor the best-selling farm machine in American history had been built on a foundation that Ford did not own and had never paid for. The settlement did not damage Ford's market position. American farmers did not care about patent litigation. They cared about whether the machine started in January and held its draft depth through clay soil in April. The Ford tractor did both. Sales continued. The dealer network expanded. The product line matured through the Ford 600, 800, and 900 series of the mid-1950s, and into the numbered series, the 2000, 3000, 4000, and 5000, that defined Ford's American tractor presence through the 1960s and into the 1970s. The Ford 5000, introduced in 1964, was the defining machine of Ford's American peak. 65 horsepower at the PTO, the power takeoff shaft at the tractor's rear that transfers engine power directly to driven implements like mowers, balers, and grain augers. A synchronized transmission that allowed gear changes without stopping the machine. A hydraulic system capable of lifting 3,200 pounds on the three-point hitch. At a list price of approximately $4,800 in 1965, roughly $46,000 today, it was the machine that a serious American grain or livestock farmer bought when he was ready to stop compromising. In 1971, Ford tractor operations recorded its highest American sales volume to that point. The division's revenue contribution to Ford Motor Company exceeded $1.4 billion by the end of the decade. The New Holland, Pennsylvania facility, which Ford had absorbed through a 1986 acquisition, but whose roots as a Pennsylvania equipment manufacturer stretched back to 1895, anchored the American production and parts distribution infrastructure that kept the dealer network supplied and the farmers running. At its American peak, Ford tractors were present on the production floors of American farms in every agricultural category: grain, livestock, tobacco, cotton, vegetable, and orchard. The machine that Henry Ford built for the small American farmer had grown into a full-line equipment presence that touched nearly every acre of productive American farmland. It was the broadest reach Ford tractors would ever achieve in America. The forces that would end it were already in motion. The American farm equipment market did not collapse in a single event. It dissolved, sector by sector, county by county, dealer by dealer, across a decade that began with rising interest rates and ended with empty equipment lots and shuttered dealerships in towns that had sold Ford tractors since the Fordson era. The first structural force arrived not from Germany or Japan, but from Washington. In 1979, Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker initiated a series of interest rate increases designed to break the inflationary cycle that had eroded American purchasing power through the 1970s. By 1981, the federal funds rate had reached 20%. Farm mortgage rates followed. American farmers who had borrowed heavily through the 1970s to purchase land at inflated prices, encouraged by grain export booms, by USDA policy, and by the reasonable expectation that farmland values would continue rising, suddenly faced debt service costs that their crop revenues could not cover. Between 1980 and 1988, an estimated 250,000 American farm operations failed, were foreclosed, or were forced into distress sales. The average American farmland value fell 27% between 1981 and 1986. The spend indices in Iowa, the collapse was 63%. In Nebraska, 55%. These were not abstractions. They were the farms of the men and women who bought Ford tractors, who financed them through Ford dealer credit arrangements, who ordered parts from the Ford counter at the local implement dealer, who had never considered buying anything else. When the farms failed, the tractor market failed with them. American tractor industry shipments, tracked annually by the Equipment Manufacturers Institute, fell from approximately 180,000 units in 1979 to fewer than 70,000 units in 1986, a market contraction of more than 60% in 7 years. Ford's dealer network, which had supported more than 2,000 locations at its mid-1960s peak, contracted to approximately 1,200 by 1988. Dealerships that had operated profitably for 3 and 4 decades closed not because Ford had failed them, but because the farmers who had sustained them were gone. The second structural force arrived from Japan, and it arrived in a market segment that Ford had chosen, almost by institutional reflex, to ignore. Kubota Corporation of Osaka entered the American market in 1969 with a line of compact utility tractors, machines in the 15 to 35 horsepower range, designed for small acreage operations, hobby farms, landscaping contractors, and rural residential properties. The machines were precisely engineered, competitively priced, and supported by a dealer network that Kubota built from scratch with deliberate patience across the 1970s. Ford had no serious competitive product below 30 horsepower for the American market. The institutional logic was straightforward and, in retrospect, catastrophic. Ford's American dealer network was built around full-size farm tractors for working agricultural operations. The compact utility segment was considered a peripheral market, too small, too fragmented, too distant from the core American farm buyer that Ford's sales organization understood. By 1980, Kubota, Yanmar, and Iseki together held more than 70% of the American compact tractor market. A segment that Ford had dismissed as peripheral had become, as the full-size farm market contracted, the fastest-growing and most financially resilient segment in American agricultural equipment. Ford had missed it entirely, and the full-size market it had staked everything on was disappearing beneath it. Ford Motor Company's response to a contracting farm market and a missed compact tractor segment was not to rebuild from within, it was to acquire. In 1986, Ford purchased Sperry New Holland, the agricultural equipment division of Sperry Corporation, itself a merger of the American New Holland Machine Company of Pennsylvania and the Belgian harvesting equipment manufacturer Clayson, for $330 million. The acquisition gave Ford a full line of harvesting equipment, combines, hay balers, forage harvesters, and windrowers that Ford's tractor-only product line had never included. The combined operation was rebranded Ford New Holland and positioned as Ford's answer to the full-line dominance of John Deere and Case IH, both of which offered American farmers a complete equipment solution from planting through harvest under a single dealer roof. 1 year later, in 1987, Ford acquired versatile farm equipment of Winnipeg, Canada, a manufacturer of large four-wheel drive articulated tractors in the 200 to 400 horsepower range, the machines used on the massive grain operations of the American and Canadian Great Plains. The versatile acquisition extended Ford New Holland's product line into the high horsepower segment that John Deere's 8000 and 9000 series dominated. The strategic logic was sound, the financial logic was not. Ford Motor Company had spent more than $600 million acquiring its way into a full-line equipment position at precisely the moment when the American farm equipment market was at its deepest cyclical contraction. The debt service on the acquisitions required revenue that a market selling 70,000 tractors per year could not generate. Ford New Holland needed volume that the American farm crisis had temporarily destroyed, and patience that a publicly traded automotive conglomerate with quarterly earnings obligations could not structurally provide. Inside Ford Motor Company's executive offices in Dearborn, the tractor division's position in the corporate portfolio had never been comfortable. At its best years, Ford New Holland contributed less than 5% of Ford Motor Company's total corporate revenue. The automotive divisions, Ford, Lincoln, Mercury, consumed the capital, commanded the executive attention, and defined the corporate identity that Ford's board of directors and institutional shareholders understood and valued. The tractor division was, in the language of corporate portfolio management, a non-core asset. In 1991, Ford Motor Company sold Ford New Holland in its entirety to Fiat S.p.A. of Turin, Italy for $600 million. The transaction included the New Holland, Pennsylvania facility, the Basildon, England manufacturing plant, the Winnipeg Versatile operation, the engineering files, the dealer agreements, the parts distribution network, every physical and institutional asset that Ford had accumulated in agricultural equipment over 74 years of American production. Then the sentences got shorter. The Ford name was retained temporarily under license. It disappeared from tractor hoods by 1999. The New Holland name replaced it. The blue paint stayed. The American ownership did not. The Dearborn engineering office closed. The New Holland plant continued under Italian management. The dealer network was absorbed into CNH Global. 74 years of American agricultural engineering. Gone from the nameplate, gone from the ownership structure, gone from Dearborn. The farms remained. The Ford tractors on them remained. The company that built them did not. The New Holland name that replaced Ford on tractor hoods after 1999 was not a foreign imposition on an American product. It was, in its own way, a continuation. The same Pennsylvania manufacturing roots, the same three-point hitch architecture, the same dealer infrastructure, now operating under Italian corporate ownership and a Belgian-derived brand identity. CNH Global, the company formed when Fiat's agricultural equipment holdings merged with KC Corporation in 1999, became one of the two largest agricultural equipment manufacturers on Earth. The machines that came out of the New Holland, Pennsylvania plant after the Fiat acquisition were competently engineered and commercially successful. They were not Ford tractors. The difference was not mechanical. It was the severing of a specific American industrial lineage. The direct line from Henry Ford's 1917 Dearborn factory to the 8N on the family farm, to the dealer on the county road who knew the farmer's name and stocked the parts before they were needed. That lineage, once broken, does not reconstitute under a different nameplate, regardless of the quality of the machine that carries it. What reconstituted instead was something Ford Motor Company had not anticipated and could not have planned. One of the largest and most active vintage equipment communities in American agricultural history. The Ford 8N, produced between 1947 and 1952, more than 500,000 units, became the most sought-after vintage tractor in the American secondary market. Working examples in good mechanical condition sell today for $4,000 to $12,000 at American farm auctions conducted by Ritchie Brothers, Iron Planet, and Heritage Global Partners. Fully restored examples with correct gray and red paint, original decals, and rebuilt engines regularly bring $15,000 to $18,000 at specialty tractor shows across the Midwest. The Ford 9N and 2N models that preceded it command comparable premiums among collectors who understand the historical sequence. The online community that formed around these machines is substantial and serious. The Ford 9N, 2N, and 8N forum, operating continuously since the early years of internet agricultural communities, carries more than 150,000 registered members. The Yesterday's Tractors online community, which covers the full range of vintage American farm equipment, lists the Ford 8N as its single most frequently discussed machine year after year. Practical machinist and home shop machinist communities regularly feature threads on maintaining and rebuilding Ford tractor hydraulic systems, the original Ferguson-derived draft control mechanism that, properly maintained, still functions with the precision its designers intended in 1938. The reason these machines remain in active agricultural use, not merely displayed at shows but working American soil, is not nostalgia, it is engineering. A Ford 8N in sound mechanical condition requires no diagnostic computer, no software update, no dealer authorization to service. Every wear component, pistons, bearings, hydraulic seals, ignition points, carburetor jets, is available from American agricultural parts suppliers at prices that make maintenance economically rational. The three-point hitch that Harry Ferguson designed and Ford manufactured lifts implements as reliably in 2024 as it did in 1950. For a small American farm operation of 50 to 150 acres, the scale that the Ford tractor was originally designed to serve, a well-maintained 8N remains a fully capable working machine at a capital cost that no new equipment can approach. The physical sites of Ford's American tractor history carry their own weight. The Fairlane Estate in Dearborn, Michigan, where Henry Ford and Harry Ferguson shook hands on an October afternoon in 1938 and changed the architecture of world agriculture, is preserved and open to the public. The field where Ferguson demonstrated his three-point system is still identifiable on the grounds. The Dearborn manufacturing complex where the Fordson Model F and the Ford 9N were built has been largely redeveloped, its industrial character replaced by commercial construction that carries no acknowledgement of what was made there. The New Holland, Pennsylvania plant still operates under CNH industrial ownership, producing New Holland branded equipment for the American and export markets. The building that once carried Ford's name on its exterior now carries a different one. The machines inside it are well made. They are assembled in Pennsylvania by American workers. They are not, in any ownership or engineering sense, American machines. Here is the detail that reframes everything. The three-point hitch system that Ford and Ferguson proved in a Dearborn field in 1938 was codified by the International Organization for Standardization as ISO 730 in 1961. Every tractor manufactured on Earth today, John Deere, Kubota, Fendt, Mahindra, New Holland, Case IH, Massey Ferguson, incorporates a version of that standard. The geometry Ferguson drew, the system Ford built, the architecture they proved together on a Michigan afternoon with a handshake and no lawyers, is now the universal mechanical language of agricultural equipment worldwide. No company pays Ford a royalty for it. No tractor carries Ford's name because of it. The standard outlasted the company that proved it. The architecture outlasted the American ownership that built it. The handshake outlasted everything. Ford tractors did not fail because American farmers stopped needing them. They did not fail because the engineering became obsolete or the product lost its competitive integrity. They were removed from American ownership by a corporate portfolio decision made by people whose primary business was automobiles, who looked at a division generating less than 5% of corporate revenue in a contracting market and calculated that $600 million from Fiat was worth more than the institutional continuation of something Henry Ford had built as a personal mission. The calculation was financially defensible. It was also the end of an American agricultural engineering lineage that 74 years of family farms, wartime production, Marshall Plan exports, and 3 generations of farm boys trained on a gray and red machine had built into something that no balance sheet category fully captures. Henry Ford wanted to free the American farmer from the horse. He did. The machine that accomplished it is still running on American farms today. Gray hood, red wheels, Ford script on the nameplate, holding draft depth through clay soil on an October morning in Ohio the same way it held it in 1950. The company that made it is gone from the nameplate. The farmer running it knows the difference. He bought it at an estate auction for $6,500, replaced the hydraulic seals himself on a Saturday afternoon in his own shop, and has not needed a dealer or a software update or a corporate parts authorization since. That machine on that farm, doing that work, still accurate, still capable, still bearing the name of a man who grew up behind a horse in Dearborn, Michigan, and decided that no American farmer should have to, is the full measure of what Ford built, what Ford lost, and what the American farm kept anyway. See you in the next one.